Yeah, that's it from my side. And I ask now Rudy to continue.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Rudy Kammerer, and I know several of you. It's nice to see you. Antje and I organize the regional group of Zieta Germany. And just a few sentences in introducing Helen. I personally started in the intercultural field about 20 years ago, and shortly after that, I read my first article written by Helen on reconsidering Chinese modesty. And I quickly understood she was drawing on her personal experience very much when working in China. And what was also interesting was that from her training, she combined psychology and linguistic pragmatics. That appealed to me tremendously. So that meant that she wasn't looked at the large-scale construct called culture, as some people do, but she looked at what people actually do, people from a different background. And consequently, she was interested in politeness, rapport building, and something that is reflected in the title of that book, which she wrote together with Peter Franklin, whom I see here sitting in Cambridge, obviously. And I would draw your attention to the second word, interaction. That's actually what she's focusing on. Besides that, I can recommend the book, although it's 10 years old, because it's a very helpful, comprehensive overview of different theories, practices, and research. Another title, Culture is Speaking, gives away the message, of course. So all these books present a balanced view of contributions of various academic fields. What I found exceptional from the beginning on was the fact that Helen was present. She took part and recorded actual top management business meetings between Chinese and Americans, or Chinese and UK business people. And this kind of empirical basis, I didn't find very often in academic publications. So that's a very special feature. But Helen is much more than a researcher. She's also a practitioner. And if you're familiar with the academic situation in Britain, you will know that she's very active in the field of internationalization of UK universities. So it's this combination of sound research with practical teaching and training that makes Helen such an interesting lecturer for Zieta. So it's our great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. Helen, it's all yours now.
Thank you very much, Rudy, and thank you everyone for joining. I can only see a small number of faces, but many I already recognize. So many thanks for joining. So I'm going to now try to share my screen so you can see the talk. Okay, can everybody see that? Hopefully now, of course, I can't see the chat. Okay, she's giving me a thumbs up. Excellent. So today I want to talk about these new perspectives on intercultural politeness. As Rudy has kind of indicated, this has been a journey for me. And okay, I see I was muted by mistake. So it's a personal journey, and so it's still a journey that I'm on. And today I want to cover these kinds of things. First of all, a little bit of background on politeness theory. Then we'll look at a couple of incidents, some of those business ones that Rudy was mentioning. And then probably the main part, looking at the new perspectives on intercultural politeness, particularly how we judge that, how culture affects it, and then finally moving on to the implications for training, and to give you some little follow-up ideas for resources. Okay, first then, thinking a little bit about the background. How is politeness traditionally conceived within linguistics? And you'll see from this that in the early days, it was very much around relations, actually, and relating, avoiding confrontation, avoiding aggression, or maintaining friendly relations. So I put a couple of quotes there from well-known people, Robin Lakoff, Jeffrey Leach. So the idea was you need politeness in order to avoid problems or to actually be friendly. The focus was very much on the linguistic strategies. So Brown and Levinson were talking about face-threatening acts like requests or disagreement, and we're saying choose your level of directness, how weighty or serious it is. The more serious, the more indirect. And then you had Leach saying it's a question of maxims, things like tact, modesty, that you need to pay attention to. Now, in all this work, the starting point was actually language, not relations. So the purpose was to explain why people don't simply speak plainly and briefly. So there was a lot of focus on strategies for managing politeness, and then later something on strategies to convey impoliteness. Culture actually played a very low, had a very low role in all of this. Brown and Levinson basically took a universal approach, saying their framework applied across the world. The only differences were in terms of relations, power and distance might be different. Lots of comparative studies, cross-cultural pragmatics, and basically looking at things like, how do you make a request? How do I make a request? Is it the same? Is it different? But culture was not unpacked, you could say, at that point. It was just a kind of monolith. Anything that was different was just culture. I think it's fair to say that most linguists were very opposed to work by people like Hofstede and so on values, regarding them as dangerous overgeneralizations. So that was some of the traditional work. What has happened more recently? I would say the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years, there's been what's known as the relational turn. Now, as I said, actually, politeness has always been to do with relations. But the notion of relations and relating came to the fore. And the other most recent development has been around evaluation. That politeness is not so much a matter of the actual strategies, but actually belongs to the person listening who's making that judgment as to whether something is polite or not. That then is in many ways in line with my own concerns. Those of you who are familiar with my work on rapport, where my focus there was on the things, what kind of things would make people upset? I might diverge now and say, you may wonder, why did I start that? It actually came from a business context. And business school at the University of Manchester did a study where they compared Chinese perceptions of different European nations on how good they were at doing business in various aspects. One of those aspects was on building relations. And the UK, Britain, was bottom. They thought we were the worst country out of all, there was Italy, Germany, Japan, etc. Britain was the worst. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, maybe not surprising, but can we do some research to find out why? And so the framework that I developed from that came out of some research based on that. I think the recent work, though, and if we're to move to an intercultural thing, we have to be able to conceptualize culture in a better way and incorporate it into those politeness frameworks. It's, I think, increasingly acknowledged in cross-cultural psychology that you can't go directly from values to behavior. They don't link directly. You have to have something kind of in between. And so the work at present, you also need frameworks to explain the actual interaction. So there's a lot of work, I think, going on in psychology, as well as perhaps a little more in politeness theory, to say, how can we bring these notions together? So in a moment, that's what I want to talk to you about. Okay, can you still hear me? I can hear somebody else talking. Okay, I can hear a Chinese person talking.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Can the person who controls the
Sorry for the interruption. Everybody is now muted, and I will put the audio on for Helen.
Okay.
And also, of course, for Rudy. Yes. Okay.
Okay, fine. So let me now share a couple of, I might call them rapport-sensitive incidents, and then we'll use those to think about how we could analyze them in a new kind of way. Okay, number one, this you may be familiar with because I've written about this. Chinese company came to a British company after they'd sold the equipment, and they were going to be having a post-sales training. Welcome meeting. The British chairman gave a welcome speech, asked the British staff each to introduce themselves, and they did. He then turned to the Chinese delegation, the visitors, and said, could you now each introduce yourselves? Resulted in confusion. 30 seconds or so, they were all looking at each other, discussing, and then things continued. They were very angry. They cancelled all the training that had been arranged for them and spent 10 days shopping and sightseeing at the company's expense. So, question, what went wrong and how did culture impact that? Incident number 2. Chinese ministerial delegation, in other words, from a part of the government, a ministry delegation, went to the United States to enhance their relations, build partnerships, and they were at a farewell banquet hosted by the Americans. The hosts and guests were seated at a number of different tables. You can imagine quite a large number of people, all at different tables. Everybody had wine, of course, and other soft drinks and so on. The most senior American present proposed a toast to the delegation. Everyone chatted informally, seemed okay. But in the evening, and it was a very interesting study this, because every evening the head of the delegation called a meeting from for all the Chinese members of the delegation to talk about how the day had gone and how they got on with the Americans. So at that evening meeting, they complained the farewell banquet was disappointing, only so-so. Why? So what we see here is 2 occasions where people made an evaluative judgment. So they made the evaluation, they were angry, and so on in the first. This one, they were disappointed. So I want to talk through some of the recent work that I've been doing on evaluation and how do people make these evaluation judgments. After we've done that, I'll think about culture. Okay, the first thing to say is context is key. When you're talking about interaction and what people are expecting, it's always contextually based. So the first thing that's really important is that we need some kind of framework that we can understand context. There are various ways of analyzing context. One of the ones I think that I've found useful, it's not perfect, but is useful, is this notion of communicative activity. And that affects people's expectations. So if we take, for instance, now we're in a webinar, and Antia started by giving some directions as to who could ask questions, who would be muted, and so on. So one thing you see, so a communicative activity like a webinar, it has a purpose. You know, presumably you have joined, you know, for a particular purpose, information you want to gain or something. But they're also enactment procedures. And so Antia at the beginning was explaining some of those procedures, what will happen, what you can or can't do, when you'll have the chance to ask questions, and so on. Then you've got roles, the rights and obligations and so on of the participants. So Antia is in charge of the technical side. Rudy is in charge of the introduction and that side. I'm responsible for giving the talk. You will be responsible for asking questions at the end and so on. So we all have rights and obligations, things that we can do, what we can't do. Artifacts, we need a computer, we need a webcam, we need certain artifacts for this communicative activity to take place. And then there's the environment, how formal is it, and so on. This, hopefully you'll see, is a very useful framework because we'll see later, culturally, people may interpret those aspects differently. So if we go back to the first one, the first example I gave just now, the British chairman had given his speech. He then asked the visitors to introduce themselves. He didn't invite them to give a return speech. Afterwards, that head of delegation said, according to our home customs and protocol, speech is delivered on the basis of reciprocity. He's made his speech and I'm expected to say something. Condescension was implied. So what you've got there is, if you look from a context point of view, there were procedural norms. He thought he should give his speech. He thought as head of the delegation, that was the right he had as a role. And so he was expecting that. When he wasn't given it, he was annoyed. If you look at, we think now of the second example, this was the comments, these were the comments from the head of delegation in the evening. The farewell lunch was not bad. The only problem was that they didn't provide liquor. We had to propose toasts with red wine. So here we can see that element of the artifact, what's necessary. From certainly in Britain, to use wine would be fine. It doesn't have to be hard liquor, but from their point of view, it was disappointing because there was only wine. The atmosphere was not all right. Remember, the fourth aspect of the of that framework was talking about the atmosphere. Is it relaxed or not? Then later he says the American head person, he only proposed one toast from his table. He did not go to the other tables. I was sitting with him in the same table, and as he didn't do that, I felt obliged not to do more than the host. It was a pity. So here again, we see the procedures. He was expecting a certain way of toasting, whereas for the Americans, it was a different matter. So if we put this together, then you could see you've got behavior, which always takes place in context. Those that contextual framework gives rise to expectations. And those expectations, if they are met, we just see it as normal. And we don't hardly notice it. But if it's very unusual or very different, we will notice it. And that's when we call it the normalcy threshold is breached, and we trigger the evaluation. Some of you may have listened to Michelle Gelfand's talk, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, it's 3 weeks.
3 weeks, right. And she talked about tightness, looseness. And that's where this would fit in with this framework, because some people or maybe some groups may have very fussy. It has to, you know, wine is not good enough. It has to be liquor. Others may have much broader thresholds, you might say, as zones, and be more tolerant, than they would be more hold looser views. So this is where Michelle's framework would fit in with this. Then, as I say, that would lead to the evaluation process. And the key thing with evaluation, we use sort of criteria. We use criteria to make those judgments. Part of it could be on using the interpersonal elements that I have talked about previously in rapport, especially rights and obligations. People talk a lot about that. Sometimes, depending on the group, may also talk particularly about face or their goals. Sometimes, though, people refer to some sort of deeper things, and you could call them the kind of moral foundations. So actually now, you know, with all the race things that are coming on, you know, these would be deeper level things. These would be more moral, you know, care, harm, you know, etc., authority, subjugation, and so on. So underneath, one might say, at a deeper level from those interpersonal ones, you have more substantial, we call it socio-moral, because some will be very moral, you know, in the sense of almost everyone wherever would agree that something is right or wrong, to things that are more social and perhaps more debatable. So if we put it all together, what you get is that if it's the behavior in context, that we have expectations. If those expectations are met, if it seems normal, usual, etc., we hardly notice it. If though something is unusual, then it may trigger the evaluation process, and we start trying to understand why they have behaved like that. Or we may just make our judgment, drawing on these warrants, and decide that person was rude, etc. And often what you find is that this is a very kind of automatic process. I know when I was teaching just 2 or 3 years ago, and I'd given a lecture, and then the students had 10 minutes break, and then some were coming back for a seminar. And a Korean student came in and she said, "I am so angry, I can't concentrate on the class." And I was taken by surprise, you know, and I said, "Oh, what happened?" In fact, we took the lesson to think about it. And basically she said, "I've just been to the office and your office staff have been really rude to me. Your office staff are rude." When I went out after class later on, the office staff came to me and said, "Your student was really rude." And what we see from that is people will often jump to judgment. We often do make judgments. They were rude, etc. And what we need to encourage is to go through, help people to think through the this evaluation warrant. So then how does culture affect that? Traditionally, we've thought of culture very much in terms of values and attitudes, and that is certainly important. But we also need to take an account of cultural schemas, these things that I've been talking about, our sense of the communicative activities, role responsibilities, and the norms, the normal way, how you greet people or how you sort of do things. And all of these will have an impact. They don't determine behavior or evaluation, but they do kind of frame it so that we don't, we still often see things or on the basis of the cultural patterns and meaning systems that we have got used to. So if we add culture to that, then you can see the cultural schemas certainly affect our sense of those communicative activities. Cultural norms of affecting that notion of normalcy zone. And that's where also, as I say, Michelle's notion of looseness, tightness, loose cultures, tight cultures around that rules would come in there. If we go down to the bottom, you've got the socio-moral order, very much affected by the cultural perspectives, in other words, the values and so on. And one thing I haven't really talked about is the personal and group identities that was in the diagram. I don't really have a chance to go into that in detail, but people do have a sense of them and us and so on, which will also influence and is also part of their cultural background. Okay, so finally then, what are the implications for training? And then I'll suggest a few resources that you could use for following up. So one question you may have is, what is the role then of cultural values? So much work has gone around that. To me, it is one element of the picture. It's an important element, but it's only one element. It interconnects with other cultural patterning elements, especially schemas and norms. So for instance, you know, if you've got high power distance, then your role relationships will be probably more hierarchical and so on. And so you will have expectations around that. Having said that, though, they shouldn't be used predictively because they are always influenced by those contextually based schemas and norms. They have a framing effect, but they don't have a deterministic effect. So then you get, okay, well, what about schemas and norms that are often culturally based? The problem is it's impossible to learn them all. And, you know, none of us can know everything about, you know, all contexts. So what our approach has been is to point trainees to the key facets to look out for. So rather than telling them, you know, this or that will happen, you know, that Okay, to give you another example, that Chinese delegation that went to the States that we collected data on, before they left, they were given intercultural training in Beijing, and they were told Americans don't, they open their presents immediately when you give it to them. And then they got to America and the Americans didn't open the gifts. So then they wondered, why didn't they open the gifts? The point is, everybody's, we can't predict those kinds of details exactly. There may be trends. So we would say, what you need to is to get people better at observation, reflection, and then gaining insights, such as through the use of cultural mentors. Ask people, why didn't they open their gifts, for example. We use often simple tools. So one that we found very helpful is the 3R tool, which is a very widespread one. I mean, similar versions. Report, reflect, reevaluate. So when that student said to me, I am so angry, since it was an intercultural course, I abandoned what I was going to teach and said, okay, let's talk through this. And so we used that framework to try and help people realize how they can see things from a different point of view. And we've got, in terms of adapting behavior, so the 3R tool is very much for evaluation. The stretch tool is for around adjustment. Comes very much from Alan Malinsky's work, Andy Malinsky's work, which if you don't know, do have a look at that. Both of those are available, as you can see, on our website there, open access. We have modules, e-modules, which try to put those kinds of things into practice. If you want to read up more about the notion of culture, context, norms, that interface, we recently edited a special section of the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, and those two articles discuss it. So some of the frameworks that I've talked about today, which I realize are difficult to take in straight away, if you're interested, do have a look there, and they are again both open access articles. Finally, just to say, Rudy mentioned at the beginning, intercultural interaction is 10 years old. Peter and I are very conscious of that, wondering whether we should do an update. Meanwhile, I've got a new book out, soon coming out, or later this year, Intercultural Politeness, Managing Relations Across Cultures. So you've really today had a kind of preview of a lot of the things that are in that book. So I think that is all for now. And then if you have, I have to stop sharing, is that right? And then if you have questions, you're very welcome to ask them now.
Okay. So I would like to, wait a minute.
Can I
Sorry.
start with a question?
Yeah, for the interruption. Yeah, people should say if they want to ask a question through putting up the hand, which is to be found in the participant section. And so we can better, pick them and unmute them. Mm-hmm. That's the problem, yeah? Otherwise, I should unmute everybody. And I don't know at this moment. Okay, I did it. So everybody can unmute him or herself if you want to ask a question. So just start.
perhaps I start.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. That was very enlightening indeed. I would like to address the relevance of context in terms of relationship building, and of course, looking at it from the practical trainer's point of view. That's one of the questions we are confronted with continuously. As you mentioned, the number of possible contexts is unlimited. So how would you prepare learners other than just, well, making them aware that there might be contextual factors that might lead to misunderstandings, to frictions, to ambiguities, etc. You suggested some strategies. I'm not quite sure whether most learners are happy with this kind of answer.
Yeah, I mean,
is it clear what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? I mean, basically, most people want to know, just tell me what to say and what to do. And a sort of, you know, and unfortunately, in my own view, that's a kind of dangerous thing. And so we have to have some kind of balance, otherwise, because if there's too much detail, people have got no framework at all. So one of the things I would say, you know, people can analyze in their own context. They know what kind of situations are problematic or they're involved in. You know, it could be, you know, so we were working with one company that said it was in Japan, and they said we often have to have video conference calls with Switzerland. So they had a very specific context that they were having to deal with, you know, and how can we handle things? Or another one that's just recently come into me, you know, so we've got a very multicultural workforce. How are we going to handle that? So then you can think of particular contexts. So although there are endless contexts within any one client, you could say they are usually particular types of contexts that are relevant, particularly relevant to them. So in one sense, I would say you could start with those, but, you know, inevitably, people have individual personalities, you know, even within the same company. Not every manager of a meeting is going to handle it exactly. So within that, they still need to develop these observation skills, you know, and so on, so that they can pick up how this particular person is functioning. And I think people do that, actually. I mean, we find even with students, you know, they get to know every teacher handles the class differently. And they could get to know, oh, this one is strict on this, and this one's, you know, doesn't care about that. And so that's kind of part of life to adjust.
Thank you, Helen.
Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you. There's a question now from Vinita. Vinita, you can unmute yourself, yeah? Yeah.
Yes, I am. First of all, thank you so much, Helen. I'm a great admirer of your work, and and I enjoyed this talk very much. And I'd like to ask a question which sort of connects your famous book 10 years ago and your book, which is coming out very soon, or the one which you've just published. Is there, it would be wonderful if you could share some of the insights that you have developed between then and now. Have there been a couple of, you know, discoveries where you say, this is what I have discovered on this journey? You know, you described it as a journey. So what would be the difference between then and now? Or what would be the added, you know, the added insights which come from this period?
I mean, I think certainly if you go back, well, certainly to the Culturally Speaking book, I didn't really unpack culture very much then. I kind of put a few points, and I think in a sense at that point it was this is pragmatics here. This is the kind of cross-cultural psychology there. And they weren't particularly integrated. I think it was, you know, if I think of, I mean, I can see Peter's here, you know, on the call with the intercultural interaction book, you know, there were aspects that were easier to put together, like the adaptation. But it was also, you know, here is stuff on competence, here is stuff on understanding, here is stuff on, you know, rapport, here is stuff on assessment. So it was kind of, okay, here are these different chapters. And sometimes when you're writing, it's think, okay, now this is topic, I've kind of done that one. But I think it's, for me, it's sort of realizing they're all so interconnected. And it becomes more complicated in that sense. And so how especially to put the culture in a not too complex but not too simplistic way either. And that for me is still kind of the journey. And in pragmatics, in linguistics, I think it's fair to say people get very nervous about culture. They'll say culture is just created in interaction. And I sort of, you know, I find that hard to, you know, say, if you and I are talking now, we've just created culture. I find that hard to kind of accept. On the other hand, you know, just because I've got a certain background doesn't cause me to speak in a certain way. There's still individuality and freedom. So how to sort of marry those two aspects, I think, is the ongoing challenge.
Thank you, Helen. There's now Kirsten, a friend of our Frankfurt regional group. She ran the group there in Frankfurt before Rudy and me. And she will talk about, you know, herself, hopefully too, when she's asking now a question. Please, Kirsten. And yeah.
Thank you, Antje.
Yeah.
I couldn't unmute myself. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Helen. After reading your works for many years, I'm really happy to talk to you in person in a way. I will first talk about our lecture, and I'm really interested in, I value this approach of, you know, being very contextual and very micro in a way. And I am interested in what you said, what triggers the evaluation. This is a topic of my research, and I would really like you to ask, do you have any idea with your model how you could explain when racism is triggered? Is that possible?
Yeah, and there was only one slide where I included it, and actually in the book, I mean, this course, you know, in this new book that is in press now, we were looking for some data, and actually I selected an incident I took off YouTube, actually, which was recorded in Britain on a train, where there was a Polish man who was drinking, and he was sitting next, well, the train was full, so there was a British man next to him and other people around, and the British man said to him, "You're not allowed to drink on the train. Don't you see the notice?" And so they got into an argument, sort of very, it became very racist. Okay, not in ethnic, but in terms of nationality. And there was a lady opposite of probably South Asian ethnicity, who basically told them, "You two are disgraceful." And she was quite brave, I thought, to interrupt, because they were there with their drinks. They were quite ready to punch each other. And so, yeah, so that made me thinking, how can I incorporate that within this framework? If you look at the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology ones, did I do? Yeah. So basically, what I think the other aspect of, actually, if I, no, I was going to see if I could find an image to show you, but you may have noticed in the diagram, there was some blank on the left-hand side. And what we've got there actually is we're all members of different groups, age group, you know, national group, religious group, all kinds, you know, professional group, all kinds of groups. And in addition to the cultural patterning, you might say, this also influences our sense of identity and our sense of them and us. Of course, for every individual, because we've got all different identities, you know, we belong to multiple groups simultaneously. But it made me think, you know, in that example, it wasn't, well, it was the combination. Clearly, the British guy, you know, of course, it's all the Brexit discourse and all of this. He didn't like, you could say, non-British being in Britain. So there was clearly a sort of them and us mentality. But then he could pick on something like, you know, the rules, don't drink on the train. And he was using that, and he said, you probably don't understand this, do you? You know, look at the rules. You're in Britain. Read the rules. The rules are don't drink on the train. So he was taking advantage, you could say, of those contextual factors to justify his criticism, which actually stemmed from an identity issue. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. I will think about it, and I know that there are some other questions. So thank you so much for the moment, Helen.
Yeah, and next I see Vincent Wongaiham Peterson.
Yes, I just wanted to, make an observation about how I approach things, and maybe get your take on that, because you have talked about evaluation during this interaction, but I find that sometimes I myself do not realize the values and beliefs that I have, because I don't see that. Yeah. And I feel like if my eyes are more open to that, or other people are more open to how they would normally see things or how they would normally evaluate other people, it could play a part in helping these interactions succeed.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the whole point, that what we're trying to say is, people like that student, she didn't think it through, and these are like automatic reactions almost, so if you look at Jonathan Haidt's, it's kind of instantaneous. It's almost, it's in a kind of emotional reaction. They've been rude, or, I don't like that. And so that's just based, on our own evaluation. That's the whole point then, part of the training process, and that's where we use the 3R. So with that student, I was saying, okay, tell me objectively what happened, step by step, what exactly happened. Okay, so what did you do? What did you say? What did she do? What did she say? So that we can unpick why she, she didn't, she was trying to hand in an assignment. It was a procedural thing. She didn't understand certain procedures that were in the office, and the office didn't realize that she didn't understand them. And so part of what we call the 3R is trying to get people to realize whether it's their rights and obligations, or, you know, using those evaluation, the warrant, to unpick that, to help them to see, okay, I'm working from this perspective, but actually somebody else is working from another perspective. And that's why, you know, they had different understandings, they had different interpretations. So on that particular case, neither was actually rude. The student was not rude to the office staff. It was just, you know, a misinterpretation because they had different expectations as to what was required. So in other words, I would fully go along with your approach.